In the heart of West Africa, where the ancient rhythms of drums still echo through the savanna winds, lies Burkina Faso, a nation carved from courage and tempered by struggle. Its soil, rich with gold that has glittered since the time of kingdoms, has always attracted predators from distant lands. But in 2024, under the scorching Saharan sun, a new chapter of resistance was about to be written in blood, sweat, and unwavering determination. The story begins not with the roar of cannons or the thunder of tanks, but with the quiet rustle of classified documents in a dimly lit intelligence office. It begins with a man whose name would soon become synonymous with defiance. General Ibrahim Traoré, a leader who understood that the greatest battles are won not on traditional battlefields, but in the shadows where honor meets treachery. This is not merely a tale of a train heist. This is the chronicle of a nation's soul tested against the machinery of international conspiracy, where every grain of gold dust represents the dreams of children, the hopes of mothers, and the legacy of ancestors who bled for this sacred earth. The intelligence report arrived at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would forever change the trajectory of Burkina Faso's resistance against foreign exploitation. General Ibrahim Traoré had been awake for 18 hours straight, poring over satellite imagery and intercepted communications that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated infiltration. A train laden with gold, not just any gold, but the concentrated wealth of 3 mining provinces, representing 6 months of the nation's mineral exports, was being targeted by what appeared to be a sophisticated international operation. The preliminary intelligence suggested involvement of at least 50 operatives, each carrying credentials that would allow them to blend seamlessly into the local population. But Ibrahim's trained eye caught details that others missed. The timing was too precise, the coordination too flawless, and the inside knowledge too comprehensive to be the work of common thieves, or even typical mercenaries. This bore the hallmarks of state-sponsored espionage, and his deepest fears were confirmed when linguistic analysis of intercepted radio chatter revealed Hebrew phrases mixed with tactical jargon. 50 thieves, he muttered to himself, remembering the ancient tales his grandmother used to tell him. But this time, Ali Baba has learned their tricks. In the sterile confines of the National Security Headquarters, a building that had witnessed the rise and fall of governments, Ibrahim gathered his most trusted officers. The conference room, with its faded portraits of former leaders and maps marking the scars of colonial exploitation, became the nerve center of what would later be called Operation Golden Shield. Captain Marshall entered first, his usually composed demeanor cracked by the weight of the intelligence he carried. Behind him came Colonel Sankara, named after the revolutionary hero, Major Zongo, and Lieutenant Ouedraogo, men whose loyalty had been tested in the fires of previous coups and counter-coups. "Gentlemen," Ibrahim began, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone who had seen nations rise and fall, "we are not dealing with opportunistic criminals. This is economic warfare, disguised as theft. The enemy seeks to bleed us dry, grain by grain, until our sovereignty becomes a memory and our people become beggars in their own land." The intelligence report, spread across the conference table like a surgical map of national vulnerability, revealed disturbing patterns. Previous random attacks on mining facilities, seemingly unconnected incidents of equipment sabotage, and the mysterious disappearance of several mining engineers now formed a coherent picture of systematic destabilization. Captain Marshall cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "Sir, our analysis suggests this operation has been in planning for at least 18 months. They have detailed knowledge of our security protocols, train schedules, and even the personal habits of our guards. Someone has been feeding them information from the inside." The room fell silent except for the rhythmic ticking of an old clock, a gift from President Sankara's era that seemed to count down the moments until betrayal would reveal its true face. Ibrahim rose from his chair and walked to the large window overlooking Ouagadougou's sprawling landscape. The city below was awakening to another day, unaware that their economic lifeline was about to be severed by forces that viewed African gold as their birthright. "In the old stories," Ibrahim said, his back still turned to his officers, "when the hyenas gathered around a wounded lion, the wise elders would say, 'The danger is not in the hyena's teeth, but in the rot that attracted them.' We have rot in our ranks, gentlemen, and today we begin the surgery." He turned back to face his team, and in his eyes they saw the burning intensity that had made him a legend during the liberation struggles of his youth. "We will not merely defend the train, we will use it as bait to expose every tentacle of this conspiracy. The enemy expects us to react predictably, increase security, change routes, perhaps cancel the shipment altogether. Instead, we will give them exactly what they want, but on our terms." The plan that emerged from that morning's session was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The gold train would proceed as scheduled, but it would carry more precious cargo. It would carry the hopes of a nation and the righteous anger of a people who had endured centuries of exploitation. In the heart of Ouagadougou, where the Harmattan winds carry whispers of ancient kingdoms and modern struggles, the security headquarters had transformed into a hive of controlled chaos. Maps covered every available surface. Communications equipment hummed with encrypted messages, and the air was thick with the tension of impending confrontation. Ibrahim Traoré had not left the building for 36 hours. His uniform, usually pristine, bore the wrinkles of sleepless nights and the stains of countless cups of bitter coffee. But his mind remained sharp as a blade, cutting through the complexities of international espionage to find the vulnerable threads that would unravel the entire conspiracy. The intelligence picture had grown more disturbing with each passing hour. Satellite surveillance revealed unusual movements in the desert regions, convoys that appeared to be geological survey teams but carried equipment more suited to military operations. Financial intelligence traced suspicious payments flowing through Dubai banks to accounts linked to private security firms with known connections to Israeli intelligence services. "They're not just planning to steal our gold," he explained to his expanded war council, now including representatives from every branch of Burkina Faso's security apparatus. "They're planning to humiliate us, to demonstrate to the world that African nations cannot protect their own resources. This theft is as much about psychological warfare as it is about financial gain." The room erupted in angry murmurs, but Ibrahim raised his hand for silence. "Good. Let them prepare. Let them feel confident." Confidence breeds carelessness, and carelessness creates opportunities. He moved to the central map, where colored pins marked every known element of the enemy's infrastructure. "Look at this pattern, gentlemen. They've created redundant systems, backup plans for their backup plans. But every strength can become a weakness if viewed from the correct angle." Ibrahim's finger traced the railway line from the mining regions to Ouagadougou, pausing at strategic points. "They expect us to guard the train like a treasure chest. Instead, we'll guard it like a trap. Every security measure they've observed and planned for will become a component in their downfall." As night deepened over the capital, Ibrahim found himself alone in his office, surrounded by portraits of liberation heroes and maps that charted the nation's struggle for independence. The weight of history pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Every decision he made would echo through generations, determining whether Burkina Faso would stand as an example of successful resistance or become another cautionary tale of African vulnerability. A knock at the door interrupted his contemplation. Colonel Sankara entered, carrying a worn leather journal. "Sir, I thought you might want to see this. It belonged to my grandfather, who fought against the French colonial forces. He wrote about similar tactics, using the enemy's expectations against them." Ibrahim accepted the journal with reverence, running his fingers over the weathered cover. "Your grandfather was a wise man, Colonel. He understood that the greatest victory is not defeating your enemy, but making your enemy defeat themselves." The journal's yellowed pages told stories of guerrilla warfare and psychological operations that had helped drive colonial forces from African soil. But more than tactics, it contained a philosophy of resistance that transcended mere military strategy. "The colonizer's greatest weapon is not his gun, but his ability to make us believe we are inferior," Ibrahim read aloud from one passage. "The moment we accept their superiority is the moment we become accomplices in our own enslavement." He closed the journal and looked up at Colonel Sankara. "Tomorrow we begin the greatest test of that philosophy. We will show the world that African gold remains in African hands not through luck or international charity, but through the strength of African minds and the courage of African hearts." The Okadougou Central Railway Station had never witnessed such a spectacle of controlled tension. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, colors that seemed to mirror the precious cargo about to begin its journey, the platform buzzed with activity that appeared routine but concealed layers of strategic deception. The train itself was a marvel of industrial pragmatism. 12 carriages of varying purposes, from passenger compartments that would carry legitimate travelers to specially reinforced cargo cars designed to transport the nation's mineral wealth. To the casual observer, it looked like any other commercial transport preparing for a routine journey across West Africa's railway network. But Ibrahim Traoré knew better. Standing in the station master's office, dressed in the simple clothes of a railway inspector, he watched through a reinforced glass as his carefully orchestrated drama began to unfold. Every person on that platform, from the vendors selling breakfast to the porters loading luggage, had been vetted, briefed, and assigned a role in what would become either a masterclass in counterintelligence or a national catastrophe. The gold itself was distributed across 6 specially designed compartments, each one a fortress of steel and ingenuity. But the real treasure was not the metal itself. It was the information the enemy would reveal in their attempt to steal it. Hidden cameras, recording devices, and tracking systems had transformed the train into a mobile intelligence-gathering operation. Senior Engineer Konat, a veteran of 30 years in Burkina Faso's mining industry, supervised the final loading procedures with the meticulous attention of a surgeon. Each gold bar was not merely placed, but positioned according to a precise plan that would allow security forces to monitor every movement, every attempted breach, every moment of enemy contact with their target. "The cargo is secured according to Protocol 7, Konat reported over his encrypted radio. "All monitoring systems are active. The Golden Serpent is ready to reveal who dares to charm it." Captain Abu Bakr, the train's ostensible security chief, maintained his cover as a competent but unremarkable military officer. In reality, he was one of Ibrahim's most trusted agents, a man whose service record included covert operations in 3 different countries and whose understanding of enemy psychology had been honed through years of dangerous assignments. As the departure time approached, Ibrahim made his way through the station with the unhurried gait of a minor official performing routine duties. His disguise was perfect, not because of elaborate costumes or theatrical makeup, but because he had internalized the mindset of his assumed identity. He was not a general pretending to be an inspector. He had become an inspector who happened to possess a general's strategic mind. The enemy was watching. He could feel their presence like a cold wind cutting through the morning warmth. Somewhere among the crowd, hostile eyes were cataloging every security measure, every potential weakness, every opportunity for exploitation. But Ibrahim was watching them watch him, turning their surveillance into a weapon against their own operation. "The beauty of a trap," he murmured to himself, adjusting his inspector's cap, "is that it looks exactly like an opportunity." The train's whistle cut through the morning air like a battle cry, announcing the beginning of a journey that would test every assumption about power, courage, and the price of sovereignty. As the golden serpent began to move, carrying its precious cargo towards an uncertain destiny, Ibrahim felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders. This was no longer just about protecting gold. This was about proving that African nations could outsmart, outfight, and outlast any force that sought to exploit their wealth and humiliate their people. The enemy had chosen the battlefield. Now they would learn the consequences of underestimating the defenders' resolve. The train's departure from Ouagadougou marked more than the beginning of a transport mission. It was the opening movement of a symphony of deception that would play out across hundreds of kilometers of West African landscape. As the carriages gained momentum, their rhythmic clacking on steel rails created a percussion that seemed to echo the heartbeat of a nation preparing for battle. Inside the lead passenger car, genuine travelers settled into their seats, unaware that their mundane journey had become the cover story for one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations in modern African history. Farmers returning to their villages, merchants transporting goods to regional markets, and students heading to universities in distant cities all had become unwitting actors in Ibrahim Traoré's elaborate theatrical production. Captain Abubakar moved through the train with the practiced eye of a security professional, but his observations went far beyond conventional threat assessment. Every passenger, every piece of luggage, every casual conversation was catalogued and analyzed for potential connections to the conspiracy they knew was unfolding around them. The control room in the train's central car had been transformed into a mobile command center that would have impressed military strategists in far wealthier nations. Banks of monitors displayed feeds from dozens of concealed cameras, both inside the train and mounted on specially equipped drones that paralleled their route at high altitude. Communications equipment maintained encrypted connections with intelligence assets scattered across 3 countries, creating a web of information that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Niger River basin. Lieutenant Zubida, one of Ibrahim's most skilled intelligence analysts, coordinated the flow of information with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Her screens showed real-time satellite imagery, intercepted radio communications, and financial transactions that painted an increasingly detailed picture of the enemy's preparations. "Sir," she reported over the secure channel to Ibrahim, who was monitoring the operation from his mobile command post, "we're detecting increased chatter on the frequencies we've been tracking. They're coordinating movements to intercept us at the Kaya Junction, approximately 40 kilometers ahead." Ibrahim's response was immediate and decisive. "Excellent. Signal the locomotive engineer to maintain normal speed. We want them to believe their timing is perfect." As the train passed through the rural heartland of Burkina Faso, the scenery outside the windows told the story of a nation caught between ancient traditions and modern challenges. Villages of mud brick houses clustered around wells that had served communities for generations, while in the distance, the geometric patterns of mining operations scarred the earth with the promise of prosperity and the threat of exploitation. But Ibrahim's attention was focused on details that would be invisible to casual observers. The placement of vehicles along the route, the movement patterns of people in the scattered settlements, the presence of communication equipment that seemed out of place in rural communities. All were pieces of a puzzle that was finally beginning to reveal its complete picture. The enemy had prepared well, but their preparations were becoming their weakness. Every precaution they had taken, every backup plan they had implemented, every contingency they had prepared for was now visible to the defenders who had turned their own train into a mobile intelligence platform. 2 hours into the journey, as the train approached the town of Kudugu, the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. Drone surveillance revealed a coordinated deployment of vehicles and personnel that could only be the result of months of planning and substantial financial investment. This was not the work of opportunistic criminals or even sophisticated mercenaries. This was a state-sponsored operation with resources that matched its ambitions. Captain Abubakar's voice crackled over the secure radio. "Command, we have visual confirmation of hostile deployment. Count is higher than anticipated. At least 30 vehicles in overwatch positions. Estimated 60 to 70 personnel. They're using Israeli-manufactured communications equipment and displaying tactical discipline consistent with military training." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. This was not just about stealing gold, it was about demonstrating African vulnerability, about sending a message to the international community that African nations could not protect their own resources, about justifying future interventions and continued exploitation. But Ibrahim Traoré had spent his career studying the psychology of power, and he understood that the enemy's greatest strength, their confidence in African weakness, was also their greatest vulnerability. They had planned for resistance, but they had not planned for intelligence. They had prepared for a fight, but they had not prepared for a trap. As the sun reached its zenith, transforming the Sahel landscape into a furnace of shimmering heat and blinding light, the train approached the most dangerous section of its journey. The Boromo railway crossing represented more than a geographical waypoint. It was the stage where months of planning would collide with the reality of African resistance. The area around Boromo was perfect for an ambush. Isolated stretches of track cutting through terrain that offered numerous concealment opportunities, sparse population that minimized witnesses, and multiple escape routes that would allow attackers to vanish into the vast emptiness of the savannah. It was exactly the kind of location that military tacticians would choose for a high-stakes operation. But Ibrahim Traoré had chosen it precisely for the same reasons. Every advantage the terrain offered to attackers could be turned against them by defenders who had transformed disadvantage into opportunity. Hidden in positions that had been prepared over the previous weeks, members of Burkina Faso's elite special forces waited with the patience of hunters who understood that the greatest victories required the greatest risks. They were not there to prevent an attack. They were there to ensure that the attack revealed everything about the enemy's capabilities, methods, and connections. At 12:47 p.m., as the train's whistle echoed across the empty landscape, the carefully orchestrated dance of deception reached its climax. The explosion that derailed the rear car was not the beginning of the enemy's success. It was the beginning of their exposure. The attack unfolded with the precision of a military operation conducted by professionals who had clearly studied their target for months. But what the enemy did not realize was that every move they made, every tactic they employed, every word they spoke was being recorded, analyzed, and transmitted to intelligence centers that would ensure their methods could never be used successfully again. The gunfire that erupted from concealed positions was answered not with panic, but with the controlled response of defenders who had anticipated every aspect of the assault. As smoke and dust filled the air around the derailed car, specialized surveillance equipment captured images and audio that would transform speculation into certainty. The faces of attackers, their voices speaking in Hebrew-accented English, their coordination patterns that matched Israeli military doctrine, all became evidence in a case that would expose the true scope of international conspiracy against African economic independence. One particular intercepted communication would later become a crucial piece of evidence. Phase 2 initiated. African targets responding as predicted. Proceed with extraction protocol. The casual dismissal of African capabilities, the assumption that resistance would be minimal and ineffective, the confidence that comes from years of successful exploitation, all were captured in digital format that would survive any attempt at denial or misdirection. But perhaps the most revealing moment came when one attacker, believing his radio to be secure, reported, "Local forces stronger than briefed. Recommend immediate escalation to Contingency 7." The existence of multiple contingency plans, each apparently more aggressive than the last, suggested an operation with resources and backing that extended far beyond the immediate theft of gold. Ibrahim Traoré, monitoring the battle from his command vehicle positioned several kilometers away, watched the unfolding drama with the detached precision of a chess master, observing his opponent's inevitable march toward checkmate. Every move the enemy made had been anticipated. Every tactic they employed had been prepared for. Every advantage they thought they possessed had been turned against them. "Phase 1 complete," he announced over the secure channel. "The enemy has revealed their methods, their numbers, and their communications protocols. Phase 2 begins now." What happened next would shatter every assumption about African military capabilities and expose the fatal flaw in the enemy's psychological assessment of their targets. The defenders were not reacting to an attack. They were implementing a plan that had been designed to use the attack as a weapon against the attackers themselves. The train, the gold, the explosion, the gunfire, all had been components in a trap so sophisticated that the enemy's own expertise had become the mechanism of their defeat. As the desert sun beat down on the chaotic scene around the railway crossing, the true battle was just beginning. While gunfire echoed across the Boromo crossing and smoke obscured the battlefield, the real war was being fought in frequencies invisible to the naked eye and through channels that existed only in the digital realm. Ibrahim Traoré's mobile command center had become the nerve system of an operation that was redefining the very concept of defensive warfare. The intelligence flowing from the battle site painted a picture of enemy capabilities that exceeded even their most pessimistic estimates. The attackers were using encrypted communication systems that suggested direct support from state-level intelligence services. Their tactical coordination indicated months of training and reconnaissance. Their equipment bore the hallmarks of the world's most sophisticated military-industrial complexes. But with each piece of intelligence that revealed the scope of the threat, Ibrahim's confidence grew rather than diminished. The enemy's sophistication was their weakness. It required coordination, communication, and command structures that could be infiltrated, monitored, and ultimately turned against them. "Colonel Sankara," Ibrahim's voice cut through the controlled chaos of the command center. "Initiate Operation Mirror. It's time to show our guests what real intelligence warfare looks like." Operation Mirror was the culmination of 3 years of preparation that had begun long before the current crisis emerged. Ibrahim had understood, with the clarity that comes from the history of exploitation, that conventional military responses to economic warfare were doomed to failure. The enemy possessed superior firepower, unlimited financial resources, and the backing of international systems designed to legitimize their actions. But they possessed something that could not be purchased or manufactured. They possessed the arrogance of those who had never been defeated by forces they considered inferior. That arrogance was about to become the mechanism of their destruction. The train at Boromo was not the real target. It was the bait that would expose the entire network of infiltration and corruption that had been built over years of patient preparation. Every attacker captured would lead to the identification of their handlers. Every communication intercepted would reveal new nodes in the conspiracy. Every tactic observed would be catalogued and prepared for. As Captain Abu Bakr's voice crackled over the radio with updates from the battle site, Ibrahim prepared for the most dangerous phase of his plan. He was about to abandon the safety of his command post and enter the field himself, not as a general directing operations from a safe distance, but as an intelligence operative whose success would depend on his ability to become invisible in plain sight. The transformation began with the removal of every insignia of rank, every indicator of authority, every symbol that might reveal his true identity to hostile surveillance. The uniform that had marked him as a leader was replaced with the simple clothes of a rural laborer. The command vehicle was exchanged for a battered civilian truck that would attract no attention from enemy reconnaissance. But the most important transformation was psychological. Ibrahim was not disguising himself as a laborer, he was becoming one, internalizing the mannerisms, the concerns, the worldview of someone whose life revolved around daily survival rather than strategic planning. This was not method acting. This was the complete reconstruction of identity in service of a cause greater than personal safety. As his truck approached the outskirts of the battle zone, Ibrahim reflected on the historical precedents for what he was attempting. Throughout African history, the greatest victories against superior forces had come not through direct confrontation, but through the kind of patient, intelligent resistance that turned the enemy's strength against itself. The ancient kingdoms had defeated colonial expeditions not by matching European firepower, but by understanding European psychology better than the Europeans understood African capabilities. The liberation movements had driven out occupying forces not by winning pitched battles, but by making occupation more costly than withdrawal. Now, in the age of economic warfare and information conflicts, the same principles apply. The enemy's greatest advantage, their assumption of African inferiority, would become their greatest vulnerability when confronted with evidence of African sophistication that exceeded their own. The truck's engine coughed as Ibrahim downshifted for the final approach to his insertion point. Ahead lay territory controlled by hostile forces who had spent months preparing for every contingency except the one they were about to encounter. An African leader who understood their methods better than they understood his plan. The transformation was complete by the time Ibrahim's worn boots touched the dusty ground near the enemy's outer perimeter. Every aspect of his appearance, from the calloused hands that spoke of manual labor to the slightly stooped posture that suggested years of carrying heavy loads, created a persona so authentic that even trained observers would see nothing more than another rural worker caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But beneath the carefully constructed exterior, his mind operated with the precision of a supercomputer, cataloging every detail of the enemy's deployment. The positioning of vehicles revealed tactical preferences. The communication patterns indicated command structures. The behavior of individual operatives suggested training backgrounds and national origins. Most importantly, their treatment of him as he approached their position confirmed the psychological assessment that had become the foundation of his entire strategy. They saw what they expected to see: an African laborer of no consequence, worthy of neither respect nor careful attention. Their racism had become his invisibility cloak. The first direct contact came when a young operative, his face concealed behind professional-grade tactical gear, roughly grabbed Ibrahim's shoulder and demanded to know his business in Hebrew-accented English. The casual assumption that an African worker would understand commands delivered in a foreign language revealed layers of contempt that went beyond mere tactical considerations. "I came for firewood," Ibrahim responded, in the halting French of someone for whom it was a second language learned imperfectly. "The sounds frightened me. I hide until safe to leave." The operative's dismissive push was more than a physical gesture. It was a demonstration of the power dynamic that the enemy assumed would govern all their interactions with local populations. They were the masters, arriving to take what they wanted from people too primitive to resist effectively. But as Ibrahim stumbled away from the encounter, his hidden recording equipment captured not just the operative's words, but his accent, his mannerisms, and most importantly, his radio frequency. Every moment of contact was yielding intelligence that would be invaluable in understanding the full scope of the operation. From his concealed position in a cluster of thorn bushes, Ibrahim observed the enemy's command structure with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a previously unknown culture. The efficiency of their communications, the sophistication of their equipment, and the casual confidence of their leadership revealed an operation that had been planned and funded at the highest levels of international intelligence. But it also revealed something else: the complete absence of any understanding of African capabilities. Every assumption they made, every precaution they took, every contingency they planned for was based on outdated stereotypes and fundamental misunderstandings of the forces they were confronting. The intercepted communication that would later become evidence in international courts came during this period of observation. Local resistance, minimal as predicted, recommend accelerating timeline for secondary objectives. The existence of secondary objectives beyond the immediate theft of gold suggested a broader campaign of economic warfare that extended throughout the region. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, Ibrahim witnessed a scene that crystallized everything he had suspected about the nature of the threat facing his nation. A senior operative, identifiable by the deference shown him by others, was conducting what appeared to be a tactical briefing using satellite imagery and detailed maps that could only have been provided by high-level intelligence sources. The maps showed not just the current operation, but planned future activities throughout West Africa. Mining facilities in Ghana, port installations in Senegal, transportation networks in Mali, all were marked as potential targets in what was clearly a coordinated campaign to destabilize the entire region's economy. But most revealing was the casual way the operative referred to African governments and their security forces. The assumption of incompetence was so complete that they had not even bothered to plan for the possibility of effective resistance. Their success in previous operations had bred a contempt that would prove to be their downfall. As Ibrahim prepared to withdraw from his observation position and begin the next phase of his plan, he reflected on the irony of the situation. The enemy's greatest intelligence failure was not in their assessment of African resources or African geography, but in their assessment of African character. They had studied everything except the one factor that would determine the outcome of their operation: the determination of a people who had survived centuries of exploitation and emerged stronger with each challenge. The laborer's disguise had served its purpose. Now it was time for the general to reveal himself, but not in the way the enemy expected. The next phase of Operation Mirror would transform their assumptions into weapons pointed at their own hearts. As shadows lengthened across the battlefield, Ibrahim Traoré initiated the most dangerous phase of his infiltration. The intelligence he had gathered during his reconnaissance had revealed the enemy's command structure, communication protocols, and operational timeline. Now came the delicate task of introducing chaos into their system without revealing the source of the disruption. The first step was establishing communication with Vector 7, the elite unit that had been positioned for precisely this moment. Using a coded sequence of seemingly random movements, adjusting his walking stick, wiping sweat from his forehead, pausing to examine the ground, Ibrahim transmitted precise coordinates and tactical assessments to his hidden allies. The beauty of the system lay in its simplicity. The enemy's sophisticated surveillance equipment was designed to detect electronic communications, hidden weapons, and coordinated movements. It was not calibrated to recognize the intelligence value of an old man's seemingly aimless wandering through terrain that he had been studying for months. Vector 7's response was immediate and devastating in its subtlety. Rather than launching a direct assault that would alert the enemy to their presence, they began implementing what military theorists would later call progressive psychological destabilization, a series of minor incidents and equipment failures that would seem like coincidence, but would gradually erode enemy confidence and operational effectiveness. A communication relay suddenly developed intermittent static. A vehicle's engine began overheating despite recent maintenance. Navigation equipment started providing readings that were consistently off by small but significant margins. Each incident, taken individually, could be explained as normal equipment failure in harsh desert conditions. Collectively, they created a pattern of unreliability that would force the enemy to question every assumption about their operational security. But the masterstroke came when Ibrahim himself, still maintaining his laborer's disguise, approached one of the enemy's outer perimeter guards with information that would seem both valuable and authentic. Soldiers came through village this morning, many trucks, heading toward the old mine road. Chief says maybe 50 men. The information was accurate. Vector 7 had indeed moved 50 men toward the old mine road. But their purpose was not to establish a blocking position or launch an attack. They were there to be discovered, to draw enemy attention and resources away from the primary battle zone where the real intelligence-gathering operation was reaching its climax. The enemy's response to this intelligence revealed the sophistication of their operation and the fundamental flaw in their strategic thinking. They immediately began repositioning forces to counter a threat that existed exactly where they expected it to exist. Their tactical competence was flawless. Their strategic understanding was completely wrong. As Ibrahim watched hostile operatives redeploy according to textbook counterinsurgency procedures, he marveled at the predictability of forces that had been trained to fight the same war in every theater. They were implementing solutions that had worked in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria without recognizing that they were now operating in an environment where their enemies had studied those very solutions and prepared counters for each one. The critical breakthrough came when enemy communications revealed the existence of a local asset, someone within Burkina Faso's government or military who was providing real-time intelligence to the attacking forces. The intercepted message was brief but damning. Asset confirms gold train carrying full quarterly shipment. Local security unaware of our presence. Proceed as planned. This single communication transformed Ibrahim's understanding of the threat from serious to existential. The enemy was not operating blind. They had eyes and ears within his own command structure. Every plan, every movement, every tactical decision was potentially compromised from the moment it was conceived. But rather than despair, Ibrahim felt a cold satisfaction settle over him like armor. The existence of a traitor was not an obstacle to his plan, it was the final component needed to make the plan complete. A network of traitors could be exposed, documented, and dismantled, but first, they had to be allowed to reveal themselves completely. As the desert sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched the cargo they were all fighting to control, Ibrahim prepared for the next phase of an operation that was about to evolve from intelligence gathering to active combat. The enemy had revealed their methods, their capabilities, and their connections. Now it was time to reveal his own. As night fell over the Boromo crossing, the battlefield transformed from a theater of conventional combat into an arena where shadows held more power than gunfire. The enemy had established defensive positions that would have been formidable against traditional assault tactics, but Ibrahim Traoré had not spent months planning a traditional assault. The darkness that concealed enemy movements also concealed the deployment of technology that would have seemed like science fiction to previous generations of African military leaders. Night vision systems, thermal imaging, and acoustic monitoring equipment, all purchased with revenues from the very gold mines the enemy sought to plunder, created a surveillance net that turned every hostile position into a monitored location. But the most sophisticated technology deployed that night was not electronic, it was psychological. Ibrahim had recognized that the enemy's greatest vulnerability was their inability to conceive of African tactical innovation. They had prepared for everything except the possibility that they were facing an opponent who understood their methods better than he understood his. Vector 7's final positioning was complete by 2100 hours, but their deployment defied every principle of conventional military doctrine. Rather than concentrating force for maximum impact, they had dispersed into individual positions that would allow each operative to function as both observer and actor in the drama about to unfold. The beauty of this approach lay in its reversal of traditional power dynamics. Instead of attempting to match the enemy's firepower or technological sophistication, it leveraged the one advantage that could not be purchased or manufactured: intimate knowledge of local terrain combined with the motivation of those defending their homeland against foreign exploitation. Each Vector 7 operative carried equipment that reflected this philosophy. In addition to standard combat gear, they possessed recording devices that would document every aspect of the enemy's methods, communication interceptors that would capture tactical discussions, and most importantly, evidence-gathering tools that would ensure no detail of the conspiracy would escape documentation. Ibrahim's position offered a perfect vantage point for observing the enemy's final preparations, but more importantly, it allowed him to monitor their psychological state as the operation entered its most critical phase. The casual confidence that had characterized their earlier communications was giving way to subtle signs of tension and uncertainty. The equipment malfunctions introduced by Vector 7 were having their intended effect. Radio communications included increasing references to technical difficulties. Vehicle operators were reporting navigation anomalies that forced frequent recalibration. Supply lines were experiencing minor delays that, while not operationally significant, contributed to a growing atmosphere of unease. "All units, report ready," came the intercepted communication from the enemy command post. Local interference minimal, extraction window confirmed, but underlying the professional delivery was a tension that suggested the operation was not proceeding with the effortless superiority its planners had anticipated. As midnight approached, the true scope of the enemy operation became visible through thermal imaging and communication intercepts. What had appeared to be a sophisticated heist was revealed as something far more comprehensive: a coordinated assault on multiple targets throughout the region, with the gold train serving as both prize and proof of concept for future operations. Intercepted orders revealed simultaneous actions planned for mining facilities in 3 countries, port operations in 2 coastal cities, and financial installations in 4 regional capitals. The theft of Burkina Faso's gold was not an isolated incident, but the opening move in a campaign designed to demonstrate African vulnerability to international audiences and local populations alike. But the intelligence coup of the evening came when communication intercepts revealed the identity of high-ranking officials in multiple governments who were coordinating with the attacking forces. The corruption was not limited to individual traitors, but extended to systematic penetration of African institutions by foreign intelligence services. At 0147 hours, as the enemy prepared to initiate their final assault on the disabled train, Ibrahim made the decision that would determine whether his months of preparation would result in victory or catastrophe. Rather than continuing his passive intelligence gathering role, he activated the command sequence that would transform Vector 7 from observers to active participants. The signal was deceptively simple, a specific pattern of movements that triggered a response designed to be both devastating and completely documented. Every action that followed would be recorded, analyzed, and preserved as evidence of what happened when African intelligence met foreign arrogance on terrain of the defender's choosing. The transformation of Vector 7 from hidden observers to active participants occurred with the precision that would have impressed military instructors at the world's most advanced training facilities. But this was not a demonstration of superior firepower or technological advantage. It was an exhibition of what happened when tactical intelligence met strategic patience on African soil. The first phase of the engagement was designed not to inflict maximum damage, but to create maximum confusion while gathering maximum intelligence. Stun grenades deployed simultaneously from multiple positions created sensory overload that disabled coordination without causing permanent harm. The goal was capture, not killing. Live prisoners could provide information that dead enemies could not. Each Vector 7 operative had been assigned specific targets based on the intelligence gathered during Ibrahim's infiltration. Communications specialists were neutralized first, preventing coordination between enemy units. Vehicle operators were disabled next, eliminating escape routes. Command personnel were isolated last, ensuring they remained functional long enough to reveal the full extent of their operational plans. What followed was a master class in the application of asymmetric warfare principles to modern combat situations. The enemy had prepared for resistance, but they had prepared for the kind of resistance they had encountered in other theaters: disorganized, under-equipped local forces fighting with courage but lacking tactical sophistication. Instead, they found themselves facing an opponent who had studied their methods, anticipated their responses, and prepared counters for each tactical option they might choose. Every advantage they possessed, superior equipment, extensive training, detailed intelligence, became a disadvantage when confronted with an enemy who understood their doctrine better than they understood his. The capture of Moshe, the tactical coordinator of the operation, occurred exactly as Ibrahim had planned. The agent's attempt to deploy his rifle was neutralized not through superior reflexes or overwhelming force, but through precise application of pressure at the moment and location that would render resistance impossible while preserving the captive's ability to provide information. When Ibrahim Traoré removed his laborer's disguise and stood before the captured operatives in full military uniform, the psychological impact was as devastating as any weapon deployed during the engagement. The casual contempt that had characterized enemy attitudes toward African capabilities was replaced by shocked recognition of how completely they had been outmaneuvered. "You thought you were hunting prey," Ibrahim said in perfect English, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had orchestrated every aspect of their defeat. "Instead, you became specimens in a study of how arrogance creates vulnerability. Every move you made was observed, recorded, and analyzed. Your expertise became the instrument of your defeat." The captured equipment told the story of an operation funded and equipped at levels that confirmed state sponsorship. Israeli-manufactured weapons, encrypted communication systems, and tactical gear that was not available through commercial channels painted a picture of official involvement that extended far beyond the actions of rogue operatives or private mercenaries. The documentation gathered during the operation was comprehensive beyond anything previously achieved in counterintelligence operations in West Africa. Video recordings of tactical coordination, audio intercepts of command communications, and photographic evidence of equipment and personnel created an evidentiary foundation that would survive any attempt at denial or misdirection. But perhaps most damaging to enemy interests was the revelation of their psychological assessment of African capabilities. Intercepted planning documents revealed assumptions so racist and dismissive that they would embarrass even the most ardent supporters of the political movements that had sponsored the operation. Local resistance negligible, read one tactical assessment. African military forces lack coordination and equipment necessary for effective response. Operation should proceed with minimal security precautions. The document was signed by officials whose names would soon become international embarrassments for the governments that employed them. As dawn approached and the full scope of the captured intelligence became clear, Ibrahim realized that his operation had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections. Not only had they prevented the theft of Burkina Faso's gold, but they had exposed an international network of exploitation that extended throughout Africa and beyond. The identification of local collaborators was particularly valuable. Bank records found on captured operatives revealed payment patterns that implicated officials in multiple governments. Communication logs identified African leaders who had been providing intelligence to foreign services. Financial documents exposed companies and organizations that had been facilitating the systematic looting of African resources. But the greatest victory was psychological. The enemy's assumption of African inferiority had been so thoroughly disproven that future operations would require complete reassessment of methods, goals, and feasibility. The age of casual exploitation backed by assumptions of racial superiority was ending, and its conclusion was being written in the desert sand around a disabled gold train. As the sun rose over the battlefield where African intelligence had triumphed over foreign arrogance, Ibrahim Traoré prepared for the next phase of an operation that had evolved from defensive action to strategic transformation. The captured enemies would be processed according to international law, but the intelligence they had provided would be processed according to African interests. The warehouse that served as an impromptu detention facility had been transformed into something that transcended mere imprisonment. It had become a laboratory for studying the psychology of exploitation and the mechanisms of international conspiracy. The captured operatives, stripped of their technological advantages and sophisticated equipment, faced the reality of African justice administered by the very people they had dismissed as incapable of effective resistance. Ibrahim Traoré's entrance into the detention facility marked a shift from tactical victory to strategic education. Still wearing the simple uniform that had carried him through the battle, but now bearing the authority of undeniable success, he represented the emergence of a new paradigm in African leadership, one that combined traditional wisdom with modern capabilities. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. The captured operatives, accustomed to operating from positions of assumed superiority, now found themselves subject to the judgment of a leader whose intelligence and tactical skill had exceeded their own. The psychological reversal was complete. The hunters had become the hunted. The experts had become the students. The superior had become the subordinate. The interrogation process that followed was unlike anything in the standard intelligence manual. Rather than employing coercion or intimidation, Ibrahim implemented what he called educational interrogation, a method that used the captive's own assumptions and prejudices as tools for extracting information. Each prisoner was presented with evidence of their operation's failure, but more importantly, with evidence of how thoroughly their methods had been anticipated and countered. The tactical plans they considered secret had been known to their opponents for weeks. The intelligence sources they considered secure had been monitored and controlled. The local assets they considered reliable had been identified and neutralized. The psychological impact was profound. Operatives who had been trained to resist traditional interrogation methods found themselves confronting evidence that their entire professional identity had been based on false assumptions. Their expertise in conventional tactics became worthless when faced with unconventional countermeasures. Their confidence in technological superiority crumbled when confronted with evidence of tactical inferiority. The breakthrough came when Moshe, the operation's tactical coordinator, began to speak not because of any pressure applied during interrogation, but because of his inability to process the reality of his defeat. His confession was less an admission of guilt than an expression of bewildered rage at the collapse of his worldview. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice carrying the frustration of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been proven wrong. "African forces don't have this capability. African intelligence doesn't operate at this level. African leaders don't think strategically." The racism underlying his shock was so complete that it had become a tactical vulnerability. The operations planners had been so certain of African inferiority that they had not bothered to prepare for African competence. Their contempt had become their blindness, and their blindness had become their defeat. The documents recovered from the captured operatives painted a picture of systematic exploitation that extended far beyond the immediate theft of gold. Bank records revealed financial networks designed to drain African resources through seemingly legitimate business transactions. Communication logs exposed coordination between foreign intelligence services and African officials who had sold their nation's interests for personal gain. Most damaging was the discovery of operational plans for similar actions throughout the region. The theft of Burkina Faso's gold was intended as a proof of concept for operations targeting Ghana's cocoa exports, Nigeria's oil infrastructure, and the Democratic Republic of Congo's mineral wealth. The gold was not mere theft, but the systematic demonstration of African vulnerability to international audiences. Ibrahim's offer of clemency to prisoners who cooperated fully with the investigation was not motivated by weakness but by strategic calculation. Living witnesses to the conspiracy would be more valuable than martyred operatives. Cooperative prisoners could provide testimony that would expose the full extent of foreign interference in African affairs. The response revealed the depth of ideological conditioning that had motivated the operation. Several operatives chose continued imprisonment rather than publicly acknowledge that they had been defeated by forces they had been trained to consider inferior. Their racism was so complete that admitting African competence was psychologically impossible. But others, faced with incontrovertible evidence of their defeat and the futility of their mission, began to cooperate. Their testimony would eventually expose corruption networks in multiple countries and lead to the identification of foreign agents operating throughout the region. As the interrogation process continued, it became clear that Ibrahim had achieved something unprecedented in modern African history: the complete documentation of a foreign conspiracy against African economic independence, supported by evidence that would survive any attempt at denial or misdirection. The captured operatives would face justice according to Burkina Faso's legal system, but the intelligence they provided would serve justice according to Africa's historical needs. For the first time, African leaders would possess comprehensive evidence of the methods, financing, and international coordination of efforts to maintain their continent in a state of economic dependency. But perhaps most importantly, the operation had demonstrated that African intelligence capabilities could match or exceed those of the most sophisticated foreign services. The age of automatic Western superiority in intelligence operations had ended, and its conclusion had been written in the testimony of enemies who had learned too late that their assumptions about African capabilities were dangerously outdated. News of the operation's success spread through channels both official and unofficial, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Intelligence services throughout the region began reassessing their capabilities and their vulnerabilities. Government officials who have been compromised by foreign influences found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. International actors who had grown accustomed to operating with impunity in African contexts suddenly faced the prospect of effective resistance. The psychological transformation was as important as the tactical victory. For decades, African leaders had operated under the assumption that they were perpetually one step behind more technologically advanced adversaries. The demonstration that African intelligence could not only match but exceed foreign capabilities created a new sense of possibility that would influence policy decisions for years to come. Ibrahim Traoré's success became a template that other leaders began to study and adapt. The methods he had employed, patient intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and the strategic use of enemy assumptions against themselves, were not dependent on expensive technology or external support. They required only intelligence, courage, and intimate knowledge of local conditions. The intelligence gathered during the operation revealed connections that shocked even experienced observers of international affairs. The conspiracy against Burkina Faso's gold was part of a broader network that included private military companies, multinational corporations, and intelligence services from multiple countries working in coordination to maintain Africa's economic dependency. Bank records traced payments from companies registered in Tel Aviv and London to accounts controlled by African officials who had provided intelligence and logistical support for the operation. Communication intercepts revealed coordination between foreign intelligence services and local assets that extended to the highest levels of government in several countries. Most disturbing was the discovery of operational plans that treated African nations not as sovereign entities but as resource extraction zones where foreign powers could operate with minimal concern for local law or international protocol. The casual contempt for African sovereignty revealed in planning documents was so complete that it constituted evidence of systematic racism embedded in international intelligence operations. New regulations required full transparency in mining and export operations. International companies seeking to operate in African markets faced scrutiny that exceeded anything they had encountered in other regions. Banking systems were restructured to prevent the kind of financial manipulation that had been used to drain African resources for foreign benefit. But perhaps most importantly, African nations began developing indigenous alternatives to international systems that had been designed to maintain their economic dependency. Regional banking networks reduced reliance on Western financial institutions. Continental trade agreements created alternatives to exploitative international arrangements. Indigenous technology development programs reduced dependence on foreign expertise and equipment. The transformation that followed Ibrahim's success extended beyond policy changes to fundamental shifts in African self-perception and international confidence. The demonstration that African intelligence could defeat sophisticated foreign operations created a new sense of possibility that influenced every aspect of continental development. Educational systems began emphasizing African achievements and capabilities rather than focusing exclusively on foreign models and standards. Media coverage shifted from defensive reactions to foreign criticism to proactive promotion of African perspectives and interests. International negotiations began reflecting African confidence rather than African accommodation to foreign demands. The change was particularly evident in younger generations of African leaders who had grown up witnessing the success of indigenous resistance to foreign interference. Unlike their predecessors, who had been educated to respect foreign expertise and question African capabilities, these leaders operated from assumptions of equality or superiority in dealing with international partners. The ripple effects of Ibrahim's success extended far beyond Africa to influence international relations throughout the developing world. Nations that had experienced similar foreign interference began implementing adapted versions of the methods that had proven successful in Burkina Faso. Intelligence services throughout the Global South began coordinating efforts to counter Western intelligence operations. The psychological impact on former colonial powers was particularly significant. For the first time since decolonization, they faced the prospect of dealing with African nations that possessed sophisticated intelligence capabilities and the confidence to use them. The comfortable assumptions that had shaped Western policy toward Africa for decades were no longer tenable. International organizations that had been complicit in maintaining African economic dependency found themselves facing unprecedented scrutiny and resistance. The evidence of systematic exploitation that had been gathered during the gold train operation provided African nations with the documentation needed to challenge unfair international agreements and demand genuine equality in global governance. 6 months after the gold train operation, the full implications of Ibrahim Traoré's success were becoming clear to enemies and allies alike. The captured operatives had provided testimony that implicated foreign intelligence services in systematic violations of African sovereignty. The documented evidence of conspiracy had been presented to international courts and human rights organizations. The network of corruption that had facilitated foreign exploitation was being dismantled piece by piece. But success had brought new challenges. The same foreign powers that had underestimated African capabilities were now working actively to counter the threat posed by competent African resistance. Economic sanctions disguised as policy differences, diplomatic pressure framed as security concerns, and media campaigns designed to discredit African leaders who refused to accommodate foreign interests all became weapons in a new phase of the conflict. Ibrahim understood that his victory had been tactical rather than strategic. He had won a battle, but the war for African economic independence was just beginning. The enemy had been educated about African capabilities, but they had also been motivated to develop new methods of control and exploitation. The response required evolution of the methods that had proven successful during the gold train operation. Static defensive measures were insufficient against adaptive enemies who had learned from their defeats. The resistance network that had emerged from Ibrahim's success needed to become more sophisticated, more proactive, and more comprehensive in its approach to continental defense. New training programs were established to develop indigenous intelligence capabilities that could operate at the same level as the most sophisticated foreign services. African universities began offering advanced courses in strategic studies, economic warfare, and psychological operations. Military academies throughout the continent restructured their curricula to emphasize the kind of thinking that had made Ibrahim's success possible. But the most important development was the emergence of a new generation of African leaders who had internalized the lessons of the gold train operation. Unlike their predecessors, who had been educated to accommodate foreign interests, these leaders operated from assumptions of African equality and foreign accountability. The response from threatened foreign interests was swift and comprehensive. Economic pressure was applied through international lending organizations that had previously ignored African concerns about unfair loan conditions. Diplomatic isolation was attempted through manipulation of international organizations that had been designed to maintain Western hegemony. Media campaigns sought to discredit African leaders who refused to accommodate foreign demands. But the most insidious response was the attempt to recreate the psychological dependency that had made foreign exploitation possible in the first place. Educational exchange programs were designed to re-educate African students in Western values and assumptions. Cultural initiatives promoted Western perspectives on African history and capabilities. Media partnerships spread narratives that questioned African achievements and promoted foreign solutions to African problems. The goal was not merely to counter specific policies, but to recreate the mindset that had made systematic exploitation possible in the first place. If African leaders could be convinced to doubt their own capabilities and deferred to foreign expertise, the tactical victories achieved through intelligence operations would become strategically irrelevant. The educational initiatives that emerged from this understanding were unlike anything in the continent's post-independence history. Rather than simply providing technical training or professional development, they were designed to create a new African elite that understood both indigenous capabilities and foreign limitations. The goal was not anti-Western sentiment, but pro-African confidence based on demonstrated competence. Media programs began celebrating African achievements and capabilities rather than focusing exclusively on problems and failures. Educational curricula emphasized African contributions to global civilization and the sophisticated indigenous systems that had been disrupted by colonial interference. Cultural initiatives promoted African perspectives on international issues and African solutions to global problems. As the first anniversary of the Gold Train operation approached, Ibrahim reflected on the magnitude of the transformation that had begun with a simple decision to defend African gold with African intelligence. The tactical victory had catalyzed changes that extended throughout the continent and beyond, but it had also revealed the scope of the challenges that lay ahead. The enemy had been educated about African capabilities, but they had also been motivated to develop new methods of control. The resistance network had grown in sophistication and reach, but it faced opponents with centuries of experience in maintaining global dominance. The psychological liberation that had begun with military success needed to be sustained through cultural transformation and educational revolution. But perhaps most importantly, the Gold Train operation had proven that change was possible. African nations could defend their interests against any threat when they combined intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking. The age of automatic foreign superiority was ending, but its conclusion would require sustained effort and unwavering commitment to the principles that had made victory possible. The Golden Train had reached its destination, but the journey toward true African independence was just beginning. The treasure it had carried, the proof that African minds could match any challenge, was more valuable than all the gold in the continent's mines. And unlike mineral wealth that could be stolen or exploited, this treasure grew stronger with each attempt to diminish it. 2 years after the Gold Train operation, Ibrahim Traoré stood once again in the same office where the first intelligence reports had arrived, but everything had changed. The walls that had once displayed defensive maps now showed offensive intelligence networks spanning 3 continents. The communication systems that had once monitored threats now coordinated proactive operations. The mindset that had once prepared for survival now planned for victory. The transformation was visible in every aspect of African international relations. Trade negotiations that had once been exercises in damage control had become opportunities for advantageous agreements. Diplomatic meetings that had once required careful accommodation of foreign interests now proceeded from positions of African strength. International forums that had once marginalized African voices now competed for African participation and support. But the most significant change was psychological. The generation of African leaders that had emerged from the gold train operation operated from fundamentally different assumptions about African capabilities and foreign limitations. They had internalized the lesson that competence, properly applied, could overcome any advantage that wealth or technology might provide. The methods developed during the gold train operation had been adapted and implemented throughout the Global South, creating a network of resistance to foreign exploitation that extended far beyond Africa. Latin American nations used similar techniques to counter corporate espionage and economic manipulation. Asian countries adapted the psychological warfare methods to resist cultural imperialism and technological dependency. Middle Eastern governments employed the intelligence-gathering approaches to expose foreign interference in domestic affairs. The result was a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. For the first time since the end of colonialism, developing nations possessed the means to defend their interests effectively against the most sophisticated opposition. The automatic assumption of Western superiority that had shaped international relations for centuries was being challenged and defeated on multiple fronts simultaneously. The training programs that had emerged from Ibrahim's success had evolved into comprehensive educational systems that were producing new generations of African leaders with unprecedented capabilities. Unlike their predecessors, who had been educated to doubt their own abilities and defer to foreign expertise, these leaders operated from positions of confident competence. The curriculum emphasized not just technical skills, but psychological resilience and strategic thinking. Students learned to recognize and counter the subtle forms of manipulation that had been used to maintain African dependency. They studied the methods that had made foreign exploitation possible and developed sophisticated countermeasures for each approach. Most importantly, they learned to think like Ibrahim Traoré, to see opportunities where others saw obstacles, to find strength in apparent weakness, and to transform enemy advantages into defensive weapons. The mindset that had made the gold train operation possible was being institutionalized and transmitted to future generations. But success had brought new challenges that required constant vigilance and continuous adaptation. The same foreign powers that had been defeated through African intelligence were working to develop new methods of control and exploitation. Economic warfare had replaced military intervention, but the goal remained the same: maintaining African dependency and preventing genuine independence. The response required the same combination of intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking that had made the original victory possible. But now these qualities needed to be applied on a continental scale, with coordinated efforts across multiple nations and diverse institutions. The network of resistance that had begun with a single train had evolved into a comprehensive system of African defense. As Ibrahim prepared for another day of planning and coordination, he reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple decision to defend African resources with African capabilities. The gold train had been saved, but more importantly, the principle it represented had been established. African nations could protect their interests against any threat when they combined indigenous knowledge with modern capabilities. The children who had grown up hearing stories of the gold train operation would never doubt their own abilities or automatically defer to foreign authority. They had been raised with the knowledge that African intelligence could match any challenge, and African courage could overcome any obstacle. They would inherit a continent that was truly independent, not just politically, but psychologically and economically. The golden dawn that had begun with intelligence reports and tactical planning had evolved into a new era of African confidence and capability. The treasure that had been defended was not just metal, but mindset. the recognition that African solutions to African problems were not just possible, but superior to foreign alternatives. And in the end, that recognition was worth more than all the gold in all the trains that had ever crossed the African continent. It was the foundation upon which true independence would be built, and the guarantee that the age of exploitation was finally ending. The Golden Train had carried more than precious cargo. It had carried the seeds of a transformation that would reshape not just Africa, but the entire global order. And those seeds, properly nurtured, would grow into something that no amount of foreign wealth or technological sophistication could ever defeat. The unshakable conviction that African minds, African hearts, and African hands were equal to any challenge the world might present. In the end, Ibrahim Traoré's greatest victory was not tactical, but philosophical. He had proven that the age of automatic foreign superiority was ending, and its replacement would be an age of genuine equality based on demonstrated competence rather than inherited privilege. The gold train had reached its destination, but the journey it represented would continue for generations, carrying Africa toward a future limited only by African ambitions and African capabilities. This is not just a story of a train heist prevented or a conspiracy exposed. This is the chronicle of a mindset transformed, a continent empowered, and a people who rediscovered that their ancestors' wisdom combined with modern knowledge could create something unprecedented in human history: true independence based on genuine equality. The Golden Dawn has risen, and its light illuminates a future where African children will never again be taught to doubt their own abilities or defer automatically to foreign authority. They will inherit a legacy of proven competence and demonstrated courage that no external force can ever diminish. And that, perhaps, is the most precious treasure of all.